So I'm going to be talking about mentoring and peer support for autistic students. And the picture here is of a book that is a collection of my work that was released a few years ago. And some of the issues that I bring up are also looked into in more depth in this book. I should say I'm autistic myself and have a son who's 18 years old now, who's also classed as having severe learning disabilities and is also autistic. And today's presentation is going to be around two differing projects, and these were projects that I was mainly doing with London South Bank University a few years ago, and reflecting on some of those findings and some of the work that's come since. This here is from some early research really regarding core domains of quality of life. And these domains were picked out by an autistic researcher in the United States of America. And a few years back, one of the studies that I did was a study that looked at Asperger United magazine, as it was known then. It's since changed its name. But this was a magazine that was sent out by the National Autistic Society and was edited by an autistic editor. And most of the submissions to the magazine were autistic people contacting one another. And I looked at slightly over 20 issues of the magazine and did an analysis of its content and the various themes that I identified, and were as follows, and these were the main overarching themes. There was meeting personal needs as an autistic person, so this ranged from things like sensory issues and so on, but more individual needs. There was also strong ones about recognition from others of one's needs as an autistic person and connecting with others on the autistic spectrum especially. There was issues around advocacy and the need for advocacy support, and also the importance of relationships, whether they were with supporters or good practitioners they'd come across, and particularly with family members. But by far the biggest theme in terms of sub-themes and content, unfortunately, was what I titled Living with the Consequences of an Othered Identity. Looking at the first one, paramount within the theme of meeting personal needs was the minimization of stress and sensory overload, which is a bit ironic at the moment, and personal fulfillment through the pursuit of interest. And there's a couple of quotes here that highlight that. It makes me a very visible case of sensory issue when my spectrumite's body is discomforted by certain clothes and fabric. This is an issue I share myself. Certain fabrics, labels within clothes, things like this is a particular issue for myself. And I have always been happiest when absorbed in very detailed problem solving. So this notion of happiness being linked to total absorption in activities of interest links very well with an interest model of autism, or what's called monotropism in a more technical way. When looking at the larger theme of living with the consequences of an othered identity. One aspect of this was societal othering, encompassing issues including being excluded from social activities, attempts of others to normalize behavior, problems with authority figures and expectations of obedience and conformity, social stigma, and most of all, bullying. And this was from school to college to workplaces across the lifespan. Growing up in this way can lead to feeling as though we are wrong or defective. And for me, that led to low self-esteem and depression, as well as an intense need to find a way to improve myself and make myself acceptable to others. And you also have the issues here of social stigma, the denigration of difference. Whilst there's a great deal of psychological research regarding empathy and the importance of empathy in social interaction, there's also a great deal of evidence to suggest that this empathy tends to be given out more to people considered part of one's in-group culturally. And this empathy is less evident in one's treatment of out-groups, or people seen as outsiders, as it were. And there's many studies about this. And so in the context of autistic people, there's been research by Noah Sasson in America and colleagues, looking at first impressions and how non-autistic people often make negative first impressions of autistic people, their body movements and so on, before even interaction begins. So an important aspect of this is to remember that interaction and empathy are two-way issues. This was another quote. Throughout my life, I've developed an act to be normal, which has allowed me to interact with people, but this negates the possibility of friendship due to the fact it's not the real me. And issues around masking are quite commonplace in accounts by autistic people and the issues that it can bring. And something to notice here is the author of this piece was someone called Robert, talking about relationships. Masking is not just an issue for women on the spectrum, girls. Although masking and social pressures are highly gendered, and that impacts on autistic people differently. Masking in order to avoid social sanctions from others is commonplace and can have a detrimental effect. And the two-way interaction issues is something I've coined in previous work of mine called the double empathy problem. And as Robert said here in a letter to the editor, yet NTs find it impossible to empathise with us. And there's also issues around navigating society when one is in an othered identity, as it were. Far from being loners, most of us are lonely. And more positively, I started attending a social group for people with autism, and it's helped a great deal with my confidence. But again, around masking and the issues there, I was wondering how other people in the same position have embraced their Asperger's personality and shed the mask they've worn every day. I feel that mine will have to be surgically removed as they've grown to be a big but uncomfortable and ill-fitting part of my life. And the sense of needing connection as we all do as human beings, but what we may be wanting to connect with and over. I cannot talk about my real experience of life to most people because they wouldn't understand or be interested. That makes me feel, as the saying goes, lonely in a room full of people, and I'm fed up with it. I'd like to talk to caring, intelligent, honest people who understand Asperger's well, with whom I can talk openly. My hobbies include cycling, walking in the countryside, and rational thinking. Now, this need for connection is often found with one another, with other autistic people who have shared experiences, or through shared interests. And this is highly shown in people's articles about where they can find acceptance and not being judged by social expectation is often in spaces led by autistic people themselves. Very much a part of this was the Altscape conference was mentioned quite frequently in articles and very positively. And this is an example. When I'm in an environment I feel comfortable in, with people who are kind and tolerant and doing things I enjoy, then I'm as happy as the next person. It's when people tell me I should think, speak, or behave differently that I start to feel different, upset, isolated, and worthless. But surely the problem is a lack of fit with the environment rather than something inside my brain that needs to be fixed. And the importance of peer support is being more and more recognised, particularly within the autistic community itself. And there's various support systems that have been set up, some at the University of Kent, where I work part-time at the moment. A colleague of mine from the psychology department, Chloe Farahar, and one from the art department, Annette Foster, they've been doing work there about setting up student peer support, which is autistic-led groups, which I think is great. And there's various examples of this sprouting up in various contexts. And there's also issues, but also positivities around close personal relationships. As Mark said in this article, close personal relationships and I have what you might call a nodding acquaintance. I usually manage one every 10 years or so on average. But family relationships were often talked about in positive ways. We're all positive, and that positivity has helped us cope with everything in life. We're a strong unit. We help others and each other. And advocacy and self-advocacy was also mentioned quite a lot. And this was also in relation to autism research and people talking about the need for more participatory research. So linking this study to the next one that I worked on was around mentoring. And so why mentoring and why might that help? Living with almost constant stress and social disjuncture can result in alienation, isolation, and withdrawal from society. An effective, adequately supported mentor can help an autistic person to cope, thrive, and progress in education, employment, and participation in their community and on their own terms. Oh, sorry, something happened with my screen there, but I'm back now. And mentoring is potentially quite a cheap solution compared to many, as a way of avoiding wasting talent and improving well-being, so preventing people from hitting a crisis. Going back many years, the National Audit Office 2009 report supporting people with autism through adulthood highlighted the dearth of services for adults. And this was following a forum, Successful Futures for Adults with Autism, which was held all the way back in 2007, where many said that they would benefit from one-to-one, time-limited and goal-oriented support akin to life coaching or mentoring. The initial inspiration for this project came from autistic people themselves, what they were asking for. However, specialist mentoring schemes back then for people who were autistic were rare. And so Research Autism at the time sponsored a 2-year pilot project, and this was designed with autistic people's involvement from the outset to evaluate mentoring as an intervention. And this involved training mentors, selecting them, matching them, and both mentors and mentees completed well-being indexes, and we looked at those over a 6-month period where the mentors and mentees met up once per week, and we had 12 pairs, mentors and mentees. And supervision of the mentors was built in throughout. We also used something from personal construct theory called the Salmon line, developed by Philippa Salmon, which was a simple kind of line across a page where you mark yourself on where you are on a progress towards a goal. And in this way, you can map out what the steps are towards your goal, but also steps in the other direction. So if you're recognizing kind of if barriers or issues are pushing you backwards as well, what that might look like. And we split this up numerically so we could collect some data from sort of 0 to 10, as it were, on goal progression over this time. There was also meeting record sheets which were jointly completed, reflective journals that were individually completed after each session, interviews with mentors and mentees, and so on. So quite a lot of data was collected. I've just kind of said that. And data was collected and analysed, and this also had input from an advisory group which was largely made up of autistic people. Looking at the findings on the well-being index, before the mentoring started, the average scores from 0 to 10 ranged around the 5 and 6 mark. This is quite a lot lower than you'd expect from the same standardized measure when used with non-autistic populations, which is usually around the 7 or 8 mark out of 10, as it were, on questions about their well-being. Unfortunately, we had a small number, 3 I think it was, drop out of the study during the 6 months. And looking at the data of those who finished the mentoring program, they on average had a higher well-being rate to begin with than those who didn't. And this kind of suggested for some that mentoring possibly wasn't enough help. or the mentoring matching and just didn't work out that well for those people. But with some of the data we saw was for some advocacy support was probably more needed, and there was potential crisis looming and so on. However, of those who did finish the mentoring project over the 6 months, there was on average gains in these 3 areas on the well-being scale. The first one was that had the most difference over the time was the overall feeling of well-being, like the main top question of this questionnaire. Thinking about your own life and personal circumstances, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole? For those who finished the 6-month mentoring scheme, they'd gone up to pretty much average scores of 7.8, pretty good. And this was quite a big jump from those where they were to begin with, a difference of 1.8 on average out of 10. How satisfied are you with what you're achieving in life also saw quite a marked jump, as you might expect, hopefully, with working towards goals and so on. Interestingly, there was also a fairly big jump in how satisfied are you with how safe you feel, which you can interpret different ways, perhaps. On progression towards goals, there is even more of a difference. Before the mentoring started, people rated their current progress towards their goals as 4 out of 10. And this was on average across 3 goals that they picked out to work towards. At the end of the project, on average, they scored themselves on all 3 goals across all the mentees, 8 out of 10. So they weren't all meeting their goals in 10 out of 10, but they had made significant progress towards them. Looking at the qualitative findings around the interviews and logs and so on, the involvement of autistic people throughout the project in the research team and advisory group was seen as very beneficial, and particularly in the design and delivery of the mentor training. And the importance of good person-centered and insider-informed training was very much welcomed and highlighted as a benefit. Other things that were highlighted was the importance of matching mentors with mentees as best one could around interests, goals, and so on, and experience, but having the flexibility to change if that match didn't work out. And sometimes this would break down within a couple of weeks, and you'd have to step in quite quickly and potentially change mentors and have that flexibility built in. Boundaries needed to be supervised with care. So what the remit of a mentor role was and wasn't was clearly laid out in the training. But this needed a bit of supervision and reflection upon during the time. And that supervision from the research team was highly valued. And many of the mentors said that in their day-to-day practice, they didn't feel like they had that support and supervision in their usual work, which was sad to hear. There was kind of mixed use and benefit from the salmon line activity, but this actually proved more beneficial for research purposes and measurement than it did for practical purposes for many, although some did find it of practical use as well. And for some, it really made quite a huge difference, and this quote kind of sums that up. This helped me dig my way out of a life-threatening hole that I could not see any way out of. It reminded me to make progress towards goals. The mentor listened when I needed it, was a regular weekly marker in my chaotic life, provided an opportunity to reflect and plan and self-manage. I wouldn't have done this otherwise. So, some of the main findings was that time-limited and goal-oriented mentoring was of value to mentees quite clearly. Boundaries have to be supervised with care though, and the training and supervision must be managed. And ideally have strong involvement of autistic people in all aspects throughout such a project, because this was seen as a particular strength.